Jacinta Ardern.
Thank you, Mr Chair. It's my pleasure to give a contribution on the Social Security Fraud Measures and Debt Recovery Amendment Bill. And I really concur with the preliminary statements that were made by my colleague Sue Moroney, expressing our reservations over this bill generally. I do recall, though, from the last debate, having some discussions with people who heard our contributions and absolutely agreed with the position that we'd come to, but then wanted us to elaborate in a little more detail what elements of this bill did persuade you. And there's one in particular I want to highlight that does come under Part 1 of this bill, Mr Chair. And that is that, as my colleague Sue Moroney has already articulated, currently when we're talking about relationship fraud in particular, the status quo currently means that if that fraud is detected, the debt recovery, the burden of debt recovery sits almost entirely, because of the way the law is drafted, almost entirely often on the woman in the relationship. That's where it almost entirely sits on. And that's due to the fact that often in the relationship fraud cases it's involved a couple claiming what was a domestic purposes benefit or a sole parent payment when they weren't sole parents but were in a relationship of some description. So that's often the basis of that form of fraud, and that it is most often the woman who is then bearing the burden of paying that fraud back. When, as my colleague has said, there are situations, and they were raised with us at Select Committee and also in meetings with groups like even Women's Refuge, if I recall, that those women have often been in violent, manipulative situations where a lot of pressure has been placed on them to commit that fraud, and then they are left essentially carrying the can. Now, that is something that we are quite happy to see measures introduced that allow that to be apportioned more fairly when another individual has not only been implicit but actually has taken on a role much more overt in putting pressure on that individual to be complicit in that fraud. And so that is a particular element of the bill that we do see as being not only reasonable but helpful. Having said that, our major issue remains the lack of equity in the way that we continue to treat welfare fraud versus tax fraud. And there's a particular, and we've already tracked and discussed the fact that we're talking relative to one another roughly 20 million a year for some aspects of major aspects of welfare fraud versus fraud within our tax system, tax discrepancies that are up to 1.2 billion a year, and annual tax fraud of 141 million as an absolute minimum. So if we're debating measures that are as broad as these, and some of them we were uncomfortable with, absolutely uncomfortable with the level of broadness, if we're discussing them here, why are we not currently at the same time discussing similar measures through a bill under the name of Todd McClay, for instance? In fact, Labor even tried to extend via, as I recall, Business Committee, the scope of the Select Committee to be able to consider whether these measures should be fairly applied when tax fraud is being recovered where an individual, a spouse, ought to have known that tax fraud was being committed within their relationship, whether or not their partner was engaged in a business enterprise or what have you, where tax fraud was being committed and they ought to have known. Why are these rules not being applied to them? It's a question we will continue to raise. I know the Minister has particular views on it. I'd love to hear his contribution. But coming to Part 1, Mr Chair, and extending this debate out a little bit on our belief that it's the inequity of the way we're treating fraud that is a major sticking point for us. We know that, for instance, the penalties in this bill will not be evenly applied. And how do I know that? We have the research that even tells us that. Dr. Marriott at Victoria University has done extremely important work in highlighting the inequity of our systems. That between 2008 and 2011, for instance, 22% of tax fraud resulted in custodial sentences. And this is relevant because this bill, of course, in Part 1, Mr Chair,
Jacinda Ardern,
talks about extending penalties and the ability to prosecute. So 22% of tax fraud resulted in a custodial sentence versus 60% of benefit fraud. 60% of benefit fraud cases resulted in an individual landing in prison. Now you might say, well, the value of that fraud may have been higher. Not so. The research tells us again that the average value of tax fraud where a custodial sentence was used was $800,000. The average for a benefit fraud where a custodial sentence was applied was $67,000. I want to come then, so if we know that there's an established inequity, that is something that I would have thought that the Minister would be interested in keeping an overview of, because so much of this bill leading up to the point where the rules are applied in court and a sentence is handed down, so many of the rules in this bill are actually handed down at the discretion of the Chief Executive. And it's whether or not discretion is being used fairly across our system as well, particularly when it comes to recovery of debt. Now that's covered in Part 1, Clause 6, recovery of debt. And if we skip down to 85B, it says payments that are debts due to the Crown and include a penalty. Sorry, actually, if we skip to 9, Clause 9, Section 86, it says that it's the Chief Executive's duty to recover debt in Section 85A. And we had a discussion about that at the Select Committee when I was there in the very, very beginning and then unfortunately left, that it is up to the discretion of the Chief Executive as to whether or not, what level of debt is pursued and whether or not that was reasonable. Mr Chair, I have seen letters from Work and Income seeking repayment of a cent. So the suggestion that, for instance, where you might have a case where there might be some rational rhyme or reason, some error that has occurred, but it may be determined to be fraud on the behalf of the Work and Income, what we're now being told is that there is a duty for the Chief Executive to pursue it unless they use their discretion not to. My concern is that I don't believe discretion has been appropriately applied in the past. And there again is some research to back this up. From 1 year period of July 1st of 2011 to June 2012, for instance, if we look at IRD, they wrote off 50% of interest penalties and overdue penalties due to overdue tax amounting to $374 million for 1 year. They wrote off 50%. They wrote off $435 million in core debt. So that represented 11% of the entire collected amounts owing. Ministry of Social Development, in contrast, wrote off $8 million. That represents 2% of their collected debt. So we see a real disparity there again in the use of the discretion of those two departments. I would be extremely interested to know, and in fact I asked, can we have a comparison of the two different sets of criteria obviously applied by these two departments as to how they make a decision to write off debt, penalties and arrears? How do they make that decision? What discretion is used? Is there greater discretion for IRD than there is for the Ministry of Social Development? Look, no one on this side of the House is denying when fraud is committed it should be pursued, debt should be paid. But we're also saying that should apply for tax. And if there is going to be some discretion in the system, let's make damn well sure that it's applied fairly. Because time and time again we've seen on this side of the House that has not occurred when it comes to what is sometimes our most vulnerable members of society. So yes, of course, fraud is wrong. Of course it should be pursued. We are simply seeking equity in our system, and we know from the evidence that is being prepared it doesn't exist currently. And whenever you build discretion into your system, you're going to have further issues. And currently, this bill under Part 1 does include significant amounts of discretion. Sometimes that's very useful. If you don't want to collect that 1 cent of debt, yes, you want to use your discretion to make sure that's not happening. But currently, it seems that the discretion is not being used in a common sense way, Mr Chair, and that is what this side of the House is seeking.
Mr Chair.
Honourable Chester Borrows.
Thank you, Mr Chair, for the opportunity to speak in respect to this bill, and thank you for the Labor Party for articulating where they're standing on it and for confirming